In 2015, a British Egyptologist made a discovery that could rewrite everything we know about ancient Egypt's most beautiful queen. Ground-penetrating radar revealed something impossible. Behind the painted walls of King Tutankhamun's tomb, there are secret chambers. Chambers that have remained sealed for over 3,000 years. And according to the evidence, these hidden rooms may contain the mummy of the most mysterious woman in ancient history. A queen who vanished without a trace at the height of her power. A woman whose beauty captivated a nation, whose influence threatened the priesthood, and whose disappearance has baffled archaeologists for over a century. But here's what they don't want you to know. New forensic evidence, recently declassified archaeological data, and cutting-edge DNA analysis have finally revealed the truth about what really happened to Nefertiti. And the answer is far more disturbing than anyone imagined. Welcome back to Pharaoh's Legacy, where we separate fact from fiction in the mysteries of ancient Egypt. I'm your host, and today we're investigating one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in archaeological history. Before we dive into the evidence, if you're fascinated by the secrets of ancient Egypt, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Over 90% of you watching aren't subscribed yet, and you're missing out on investigations like this every single week. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps us continue bringing you the truth about ancient mysteries. Now, let's talk about Nefertiti. Her name means, "The Beautiful One has come," and by all historical accounts, Nefertiti wasn't just beautiful. She was extraordinary in ways that terrified the ancient Egyptian establishment. We're talking about 14th century BCE, around 1370 BC. Egypt is at the absolute height of its power, the richest civilization on Earth, the New Kingdom period, the age of empire, gold, and monuments that would last forever. Pharaoh Amenhotep III rules over an unprecedented golden age. Tribute flows in from conquered territories. The granaries are full. The temples are wealthy beyond measure. And the priests of Amun, the chief god of Egypt, control approximately 1/3 of all the wealth in the entire nation. Think about that for a moment. 1/3 of Egypt's economy is controlled by a religious institution. The priests don't just have spiritual power. They have political power, economic power, military power. They can make or break pharaohs. Then Amenhotep III dies, and his son takes the throne. Amenhotep IV, a young man, probably in his teens, physically unusual, possibly suffering from a genetic disorder that gave him an elongated skull and feminine features. Not exactly the traditional image of a mighty Egyptian pharaoh. And this young pharaoh does something unprecedented, something that will change Egyptian history forever. He marries a woman named Nefertiti. Now here's where it gets interesting. We don't know where Nefertiti came from. Her origins are completely mysterious. Some scholars believe she was the daughter of Ai, a high-ranking advisor who would later become Pharaoh himself. Others think she might have been a foreign princess, possibly from Mitanni, married to cement a political alliance. There's even a more controversial theory. Some researchers have suggested that Nefertiti might have been Akhenaten's cousin, or even half-sister, from a minor branch of the royal family. This would explain why her lineage isn't clearly documented. In ancient Egypt, sometimes the most important marriages were the ones they preferred not to advertise too openly. But here's what we do know, and this is crucial. From the moment Nefertiti appears in the historical record, she's not just a queen consort. She's not just the pharaoh's wife sitting quietly in the background. She's shown wielding power in ways that no Egyptian queen had done for hundreds of years. Let's dig deeper into Nefertiti's mysterious background, because understanding where she came from might help us understand what happened to her. The name Nefertiti itself is unusual. It's not a birth name. It's a throne name, a title she took upon becoming queen. Her birth name, if she had a different one, has been lost to history. This is significant because it suggests a deliberate rebranding, a creation of a new identity. Some Egyptologists believe she came from Akhmim, a city in Upper Egypt where Ai, the high official who would later become pharaoh, held significant influence. Ai's wife was named Tay, and she held the title Nurse of the Great Royal Wife, which some interpret as meaning she raised Nefertiti. This would make Nefertiti Ai's daughter. But there's another intriguing possibility. During this period, Egypt had complex diplomatic relations with the Kingdom of Mitanni, a powerful state in what is now Syria and northern Iraq. Egyptian pharaohs regularly married Mitanni princesses to seal alliances. There are references in the Amarna letters to a Mitanni princess named Tadukipa, who was sent to Egypt to marry Amenhotep III. Some scholars speculate that Nefertiti might actually be Tadukipa, who married Amenhotep IV after his father's death and was given an Egyptian name. This would explain why her background is obscure. She wasn't Egyptian at all. She was a foreign princess whose origins were deliberately obscured to make her more acceptable to the Egyptian people. The problem with this theory: Tadukipa is mentioned in correspondence after Nefertiti appears in the historical record, suggesting they were different people. But the timeline is ambiguous enough that some researchers still argue for this identification. What makes this relevant to her disappearance? If Nefertiti was foreign-born, it might explain why the Egyptian establishment eventually turned against her so completely. A foreign queen, wielding unprecedented power, presiding over a religious revolution that threatened the old order. That's a recipe for elimination. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to understand the religious situation in ancient Egypt. For over 1,000 years, the Egyptians had worshipped a complex pantheon of gods. Hundreds of deities: Ra, the sun god; Osiris, god of the dead; Isis, the divine mother; Anubis; Horus; Thoth; Hathor. And above them all, at least politically, was Amun-Ra, king of the gods. The cult of Amun was the most powerful religious institution in Egypt. The Temple of Karnak, Amun's main sanctuary, was the largest religious complex in the ancient world. The priests controlled vast estates, commanded armies of workers, and had the ear of every pharaoh. They weren't just religious figures. They were kingmakers. They could legitimize a ruler or declare him unfit. They controlled the flow of tribute from conquered territories. They managed international trade agreements. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Temple of Amun alone employed tens of thousands of people. Farmers worked temple lands. Craftsmen produced goods for temple workshops. Soldiers protected temple interests. And all of this economic activity generated enormous wealth that flowed into the hands of the priesthood. When we say the priests of Amun controlled 1/3 of Egypt's wealth, we're not exaggerating. Some estimates put it even higher. They were essentially a state within a state, a parallel power structure that rivaled the pharaoh himself. But Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti had other ideas. Within just a few years of taking the throne, the young pharaoh does something that would have been considered absolute insanity. He declares that all the old gods are false. All of them. The entire Egyptian pantheon, worshipped for millennia, venerated in thousands of temples, served by tens of thousands of priests. All wrong. There is only one God, he proclaims. The Aten, the sun disk itself. The physical manifestation of solar power. Not a human-shaped deity, not an animal-headed god, but literally the sun itself, radiating life-giving rays to the earth. And here's the most radical part. The pharaoh declares that he and Nefertiti are the only intermediaries between humanity and this god. Not the priests, not the temples, not the old religious establishment, just the royal couple. The Aten speaks only to them. They alone can intercede with the divine. Everyone else must approach the Aten through them. Think about what this means politically. In one move, Akhenaten has cut out the entire religious bureaucracy that had controlled Egypt for centuries. He's not just changing theology. He's staging a political coup, seizing absolute power by declaring himself and his wife the sole connection between heaven and earth. He changes his name from Amenhotep, which means Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, which means effective for the Aten. He orders the name of Amun to be chiseled out of monuments throughout Egypt. He closes Amun's temples. He redirects their revenue to the Aten cult. And he builds an entirely new capital city in the middle of nowhere, a place now called Amarna, far from Thebes, far from the old power centers, far from the priests of Amun. But here's what's truly shocking about this religious revolution. And this is where Nefertiti becomes absolutely central to our story. In the art from this period, Nefertiti isn't shown as a traditional Egyptian queen. She's shown as Akhenaten's equal. In some depictions, she's shown performing religious rituals that were traditionally reserved for the pharaoh alone. She's shown making offerings to the Aten. She's shown smiting enemies, a pose that was exclusively used for male rulers for over 1,000 years. She's shown wearing the blue crown of royal authority, driving a chariot, wielding weapons, executing justice. There are scenes where Nefertiti and Akhenaten are shown as the same size, which in Egyptian art is hugely significant. Size equals importance. The fact that she's depicted at the same scale as the pharaoh means she held equivalent authority. This simply wasn't done in traditional Egyptian iconography. Queens were always shown smaller than the king, standing behind him or beside him, but clearly subordinate. Not Nefertiti. In some reliefs, she's even shown in front of Akhenaten, taking the primary position. and in a few extraordinary examples, she's shown alone, without Akhenaten present, performing state rituals and religious ceremonies. There's a plaque from Amarna, known as the Wilbur plaque, that shows Nefertiti wearing the crown normally reserved for pharaohs and smiting a female enemy. Not a male captive, which would be unusual enough, but a female captive, suggesting that Nefertiti had authority over both men and women, over foreign policy and military affairs. The boundary stelae that marked the limits of the new city of Amarna contain inscriptions that refer to Nefertiti in extraordinary terms. She's called Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lady of the Two Lands, titles that blur the line between queen and pharaoh. In some inscriptions, her cartouche, the oval that contains a royal name, is written in a way that's almost indistinguishable from Akhenaten's. And then there's her beauty. The famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered in 1912 in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose at Amarna, shows a woman of extraordinary elegance and poise. High cheekbones, full lips, a graceful neck, and those iconic, penetrating eyes. One eye is missing from the bust, which has led to endless speculation. Was this a deliberate artistic choice? A model that was never finished? Evidence of damage? Recent analysis suggests the eye socket was never meant to hold an inlay. The bust might have been a sculptor's model, a three-dimensional template used to create other images of the Queen. This would explain its extraordinary detail and the missing eye. It wasn't meant to be a finished portrait, but a working tool. In 2006, CT scans of the bust revealed something fascinating. Beneath the outer layer of painted plaster, there's a different face. A limestone core that shows Nefertiti with slightly different features. More wrinkles around the mouth, less pronounced cheekbones, a more mature face. This suggests that the sculptor first carved a realistic portrait, then added a layer of plaster to create an idealized version. So, what did Nefertiti really look like? Probably somewhere between the two images. A beautiful woman, yes, but also a real person, not the flawless goddess that the outer layer presents. For about 12 to 15 years, Akhenaten and Nefertiti rule from their new city. They have 6 daughters together, and this is significant. 6 daughters. No sons. At least, no sons that survived to adulthood or were acknowledged publicly. The daughters' names are known: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpaten, Neferneferuaten, Tasherit, Neferneferura, and Setepenre. These girls appear frequently in Amarna art, shown playing, sitting with their parents, participating in religious ceremonies. The intimacy of these scenes is unprecedented in Egyptian royal art. You see the family relaxing together, Akhenaten kissing his daughters, Nefertiti holding the girls on her lap. But tragedy strikes. Meketaten, the second daughter, dies young, probably around age 10 or 11. There's a heartbreaking scene in the royal tomb at Amarna showing Akhenaten and Nefertiti mourning over her body. They're depicted in genuine grief, reaching toward the child, their faces twisted in anguish. This is not stylized formal mourning. This is real pain, captured in stone. Some scholars believe Meketaten died in childbirth, which would be shocking. If true, it would suggest that she was very young, possibly around 10 or 11. When she became a wife, and was expecting a child, perhaps within her own family. Marriage within the same family at a very young age. The evidence isn't conclusive, but the possibility has generated enormous controversy among Egyptologists. The lack of a male heir creates a massive political problem. In Egyptian tradition, the pharaoh's son inherits the throne. But Akhenaten has no acknowledged sons. This means the succession is uncertain. Who will rule after him? One of the daughters? An outsider? Will the Aten revolution survive without a clear successor? This succession crisis might be the key to understanding what happened to Nefertiti. If she couldn't produce a male heir, she might have fallen out of favor. Or maybe there was a son, but he was hidden or denied for political reasons. Some researchers believe that Tutankhamun was actually the son of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, not Akhenaten and his sister, and that the DNA evidence has been misinterpreted. But here's where the story gets even more complex. Nefertiti wasn't Akhenaten's only wife. There was another woman in the royal household, a secondary wife named Kia, and the relationship between Nefertiti and Kia might have been explosive. Kia appears in inscriptions as the greatly beloved wife of the king. Not the great royal wife, which was Nefertiti's title, but still an important position. Who was Kia? We don't know for certain. Some believe she was another Mitanni princess. Others think she was an Egyptian noblewoman. Her origins are as mysterious as Nefertiti's. What we do know is that Kia had significant status. She had her own estates, her own staff, her own income. She appears in art, though less prominently than Nefertiti. And here's the crucial detail. Kia seems to have had children with Akhenaten, possibly including a son. Some Egyptologists believe that Tutankhamun was Kia's son, not Nefertiti's. If true, this would create a devastating power struggle. Nefertiti, the great royal wife, has 6 daughters, but no son. Kia, the secondary wife, has a son who could be heir to the throne. The political implications are explosive. And then, mysteriously, Kia disappears from the record. Around the same time that Nefertiti's appearances become less frequent, Kia vanishes entirely. Her images are defaced, her inscriptions are chiseled out. Her name is replaced, sometimes with Meritaten's name, sometimes with Ankhesenpaten's, Nefertiti's daughters. What happened? Some scholars believe Nefertiti had Kia eliminated. A palace coup, removing a rival who threatened her position. Others think both women fell victim to the same political purge, swept away by forces larger than either of them. There's even a theory that Nefertiti and Kia were the same person, that Kia was a nickname or secondary name for Nefertiti. The evidence for this is weak, but it shows how confused and fragmentary our knowledge of this period really is. Despite the political tensions, for about a decade, Amarna thrives. The royal family is depicted in intimate, almost casual scenes that are completely different from traditional Egyptian royal art. You see them playing with their children, kissing, eating together, relaxing in the palace gardens under the rays of the Aten. This new art style, called Amarna art, is weirdly realistic and strangely distorted at the same time. The royal family is shown with elongated skulls, protruding bellies, thin limbs, wide hips, and exaggerated features. Akhenaten, in particular, is depicted with an almost feminine body, leading to endless speculation about genetic disorders, hormonal imbalances, or deliberate stylistic choices. Some scholars think the art reflects a genetic condition called Marfan syndrome, which causes unusual body proportions and facial features. Others believe it's Froelich syndrome, a hormonal disorder that causes similar effects. Still others argue that the exaggerated features are entirely artistic, a way of showing that the royal family transcends normal human appearance, that they're divine beings whose bodies don't conform to ordinary standards. What's fascinating is that this artistic style extends beyond the royal family. Nobles, officials, even common people in Amarna art are shown with elongated features and unusual proportions. It's as if the entire population is being portrayed as sharing in the divine transformation that the Aten has brought to Egypt. During this period, Amarna grows into a real city. Recent archaeological excavations have revealed neighborhoods of craftsmen, areas of industrial production, bakeries, breweries, workshops producing jewelry, textiles, and luxury goods. The city had its own police force, its own administrative buildings, its own temples and palaces. It wasn't just a religious center. It was a fully functioning capital, with tens of thousands of inhabitants, bustling with life and activity. Nefertiti would have presided over this city alongside Akhenaten, managing the daily affairs of government, receiving foreign dignitaries, overseeing construction projects, conducting religious ceremonies. For a brief moment in history, she was arguably the most powerful woman on earth. But beneath the surface of prosperity and religious revolution, things are not going well. While Akhenaten and Nefertiti are focused on their new religion, the Egyptian empire is starting to crumble. We have letters from this period discovered at Amarna in the 1880s, called the Amarna Letters. These are diplomatic correspondences from Egyptian vassal states and allied kingdoms, written in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the time. And they're basically screaming for help. The Hittites are invading our territories. Send troops, send gold, send military support. Our cities are under siege. Where is Pharaoh's army? Why do you abandon us? If you do not send reinforcements immediately, these lands will be lost to Egypt forever. Letter after letter, plea after plea. The message is consistent. Egypt's vassals are under attack, and Pharaoh isn't helping. Akhenaten seems to have largely ignored these pleas. He was more interested in building temples to the Aten than in maintaining Egypt's military dominance, more focused on religious purity than on imperial power. During Akhenaten's reign, Egypt loses significant territory in Syria and Palestine. Vassal kings switch their allegiance to the Hittites. Trade routes are disrupted. Tribute stops flowing into Egypt. The empire that Amenhotep III had built to unprecedented heights is hemorrhaging territory under his son. This is one reason why later Egyptian kings would try to erase Akhenaten's entire reign from history. He didn't just disrupt the traditional religion. He weakened the empire. He diminished Egypt's power and prestige on the international stage. He made Egypt vulnerable. And domestically, the old priesthood is furious. Their temples are being closed. Their income is being cut off. Their gods are being declared false. Thousands of priests, from the highest ranks to the lowest temple servants, are losing their livelihoods. The entire religious infrastructure of Egypt is being dismantled. The priests of Amun, in particular, are watching their 1,000-year-old power base crumble. These weren't passive victims. They were organized, wealthy, and connected to powerful noble families throughout Egypt. Do you think they accepted this quietly? Or do you think they might have been planning, plotting, waiting for their moment to strike back? There's also evidence of plague during this period. Disease sweeping through Egypt and the Near East, possibly brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns. Possibly the bubonic plague, possibly something else. Death tolls rising, unrest growing, the population suffering while the royal family lives in isolated luxury in their new city, worshipping their new god. And then, around year 12 or 14 of Akhenaten's reign, something happens to Nefertiti. Something that will remain a mystery for over 3,000 years. Let's establish the timeline with precision, because the details matter. Nefertiti appears prominently and consistently in official inscriptions and artwork up until approximately year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. After that, her appearances become less frequent and more ambiguous. By year 14, she seems to vanish almost entirely from the historical record. But vanish might be the wrong word. Because here's where it gets complicated. Some inscriptions suggest she didn't die. Instead, she may have taken on a new role, a new identity, a new name. There are references in this period to a co-regent named Neferuaten, a ruler with both a throne name and a personal name that some scholars believe included elements of Nefertiti's name. This co-regent appears in inscriptions alongside Akhenaten, sometimes performing independent royal functions, sometimes shown in contexts that suggest equal authority. Who was Neferuaten? The evidence is maddeningly ambiguous. The gender of this ruler is unclear in the inscriptions. Some versions use feminine grammatical forms. Others use masculine. The cartouches can be read multiple ways. And different scholars have reached radically different conclusions. Theory 1. Neferuaten was Nefertiti herself, ruling as co-regent under a new name, possibly taking on masculine titles and iconography to legitimize her position as pharaoh. Theory 2. Neferuaten was Meritaten, Nefertiti's oldest daughter, who took on a throne name that honored her mother while establishing her own authority. Theory 3. Neferuaten was a male co-regent named Smenkhkare, a shadowy figure who might have been Akhenaten's brother, son, or male lover, depending on which theory you believe. The evidence can support all three interpretations. And that's the frustrating reality of Egyptology. The inscriptions are fragmentary. The chronology is confused. The names are ambiguous. We're trying to reconstruct complex political events from scattered puzzle pieces, 3,000 years after the fact. What's particularly interesting about Neferuaten, whoever they were, is that there's evidence this co-regent tried to reconcile with the Amun priesthood. Inscriptions from this period show attempts to restore worship of the old gods alongside the Aten. Not a complete return to the old religion, but a compromise position. A recognition that pure Aten worship was politically unsustainable. This suggests a power struggle at the highest levels of government. Was Nefertiti trying to save the regime by moderating Akhenaten's extreme policies? Or was someone else, possibly one of her daughters, trying to position themselves as a more acceptable alternative to both Akhenaten and Nefertiti? We need to talk about Smenkhare, because this mysterious figure might be the key to understanding what happened to Nefertiti. Smenkhare appears briefly in the historical record during the final years of Akhenaten's reign. The name means vigorous is the soul of Ra, which is interesting because it invokes Ra, the old sun god, rather than the Aten. Who was Smenkhare? We don't know. Some inscriptions suggest he was Akhenaten's co-regent. Others show someone named Smenkhare, married to Meritaten, Nefertiti's oldest daughter. There's even evidence that Smenkhare might have ruled briefly after Akhenaten's death, before Tutankhamun took the throne. Here's where it gets really confusing. Remember that mysterious mummy from tomb KF55 that we mentioned earlier? The one whose identity was deliberately obscured. Some Egyptologists believe that's Smenkhare. Others believe it's Akhenaten. The DNA evidence suggests it's Tutankhamun's father, which would make it Akhenaten. But the physical age of the body at death seems wrong for Akhenaten. What if Smenkhare and Akhenaten were brothers? Or what if Smenkhare was actually Nefertiti? Some scholars have proposed that when Nefertiti took on royal power, she assumed a masculine name and identity. Smenkhare and Neferuaten might be the same person. Nefertiti ruling as pharaoh under different names at different times. This wouldn't be unprecedented in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, initially ruled as regent for her stepson Thutmose III. But she eventually declared herself pharaoh, taking on masculine titles, wearing the false beard of kingship, and being depicted in male royal regalia. If Hatshepsut could do it 2 centuries earlier, why not Nefertiti? The problem is that we have no definitive evidence. No inscription that clearly states Nefertiti became pharaoh under the name Smenkhare. Just tantalizing hints, ambiguous references, and fragmentary clues that can be interpreted multiple ways. Then, around year 17 of what would have been Akhenaten's reign, everything changes. Akhenaten dies, or disappears, or is removed from power. The circumstances are completely unclear, and a young boy, about 9 years old, takes the throne. His birth name was Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. But within a year or 2 of his accession, he changes it to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. This tells you everything you need to know about the political winds that are now blowing. But Tutankhamun doesn't really rule. He's a child, possibly suffering from genetic disorders related to the inbreeding of the royal family. CT scans of his mummy have revealed a club foot, a cleft palate, and evidence of multiple bone disorders. He would have needed a cane to walk. He was probably in chronic pain. He certainly wasn't capable of governing an empire. The real power is held by 2 men. The aging advisor who might have been Nefertiti's father, and Horemheb, a military general who commands the army. These 2 men, one civilian, one military, effectively rule Egypt while the boy king sits on the throne as a figurehead. And they move quickly to dismantle everything Akhenaten built. Within a few years of Tutankhamun's accession, the capital at Amarna is abandoned. The court returns to Memphis and Thebes. The temples of Amun are reopened and lavishly restored. Gold, silver, and precious goods flow into the old temples. The priests of Amun are restored to their former power and wealth. The Aten is pushed aside, not banned, but no longer the sole focus of Egyptian religion. It's a complete reversal of Akhenaten's revolution. Everything he built, everything he fought for, everything he and Nefertiti tried to accomplish, dismantled within a few years of his death. And then begins one of the most systematic erasure campaigns in ancient history. Akhenaten's name is chiseled out of inscriptions. His monuments are torn down, stone by stone. His statues are smashed into fragments. His temples are dismantled, and the stones are reused for other buildings, often as fill material, literally buried in the foundations of new construction. The city of Amarna itself is systematically destroyed. Buildings are pulled down. Artwork is defaced. The tombs in the cliffs surrounding the city are vandalized. Within a generation, Amarna is abandoned, left to the desert, forgotten. In later king lists, official documents that recorded the succession of pharaohs, Akhenaten's reign is simply skipped. The official chronology jumps from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb, as if Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and I never existed. They become non-persons, erased from history. When Akhenaten is mentioned in later texts, he's called the criminal of Amarna, the rebel, the enemy, the fallen one from Akhenaten. His name is literally written with the hieroglyphic determinative for enemy, the same sign used for foreign invaders and criminals. But Nefertiti's erasure is even more thorough and more specific. Her images aren't just neglected or allowed to decay, they're systematically destroyed. Her face is hacked out of reliefs with deliberate, almost violent precision. Her cartouches are chiseled out completely, leaving empty spaces where her name once appeared. In some cases, her figure is entirely removed from scenes, leaving awkward gaps in the composition. This wasn't random vandalism. This was systematic, organized, intentional destruction. Someone wanted to make sure that Nefertiti was not just forgotten, but obliterated from history. And that level of effort suggests something more than just political convenience. It suggests fear. Fear of her memory. Fear of what she represented. Fear that if people remembered her, something dangerous might happen. For over a century, since Amarna was rediscovered and excavated in the late 1800s, Egyptologists have debated what happened to Nefertiti, and the theories have evolved as new evidence has emerged. Let's break down the four main schools of thought. Theory 1: Natural death and standard burial. The most conservative, boring, but possibly accurate explanation. Nefertiti simply died of natural causes around year 12 to 14 of Akhenaten's reign. Maybe plague, maybe childbirth complications, maybe illness. Ancient Egypt was a dangerous place, even for royalty. Infant mortality was high. Disease was common. Life expectancy, even for the elite, was only about 35 to 40 years. She was buried with honors in the royal tomb at Amarna, alongside or near her daughter Akhenaten, who had died earlier. Later, when the city was abandoned and the royal tombs were being looted, her mummy was moved, hidden, or destroyed. This was common practice. When tomb robbery became endemic, priests would gather royal mummies and cache them together in hidden locations for protection. The problem with this theory? It doesn't explain the systematic erasure of her name and image. Even unpopular queens usually retained their place in the historical record. Tiye, Akhenaten's mother, who was also very powerful, wasn't erased despite being associated with the Amarna period. Why would Nefertiti be treated so differently if she simply died naturally? Theory 2. Political disgrace and fall from power. Perhaps Nefertiti didn't die during Akhenaten's reign. Perhaps she fell from grace. Maybe she and Akhenaten had a falling out over policy. Maybe she advocated for compromise with the Amun priesthood, and Akhenaten refused. Maybe she was blamed for the lack of a male heir, or for the empire's military failures, or for the plague that was ravaging Egypt. There's some evidence for this. The appearance of the co-regent Nefertiti, with its ambiguous relationship to Nefertiti, might represent her trying to position herself as an independent power center, separate from Akhenaten. If she challenged him, if she tried to seize power or institute policies he opposed, he might have stripped her of her titles, removed her from public life, exiled her to a provincial palace, or even imprisoned her. And then, when the restoration happened under Tutankhamun, she would be doubly cursed, associated with Akhenaten's failed revolution, but also with opposing Akhenaten, making her unacceptable to both sides. The victors would have every reason to erase her completely. Theory 3. She became Pharaoh. This is the most dramatic and, to many scholars, the most compelling theory. Nefertiti didn't disappear at all. She became Pharaoh. After Akhenaten died, but before Tutankhamun was old enough or stable enough to rule, there's a brief period, maybe 2 to 3 years, where someone named Nefertiti rules Egypt. And that someone, according to this theory, was Nefertiti herself. There's actually quite a bit of evidence to support this. Inscriptions show Nefertiti ruling alongside Akhenaten in his final years, then continuing to rule after his death. Some versions of the name include feminine grammatical endings. There are references to a female pharaoh during this period in various texts. And most compellingly, there's evidence that this ruler tried to reconcile with the Amun priesthood, exactly what you'd expect from someone trying to stabilize a collapsing regime. If Nefertiti ruled as pharaoh, even briefly, she would join a very select group of women in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut ruled for about 2 decades in the 15th century BC. Sobekneferu briefly ruled in the 12th dynasty. Tawosret ruled at the end of the 19th dynasty. And of course Cleopatra at the very end of ancient Egyptian civilization. Female pharaohs were rare, but not unprecedented. But if she ruled, what happened to her? Why would her reign be erased? The answer might be that she failed. The empire continued to crumble. The plague continued. The military situation worsened. And when she died or was removed from power, the new regime had every reason to obliterate her memory. She represented not just Akhenaten's failed revolution, but her own failed attempt to salvage it. Theory 4. Assassination and conspiracy. And now we get to the darkest theory. The one that suggests Nefertiti didn't just die or fade away. She was eliminated, murdered, assassinated by conspirators who saw her as the primary obstacle to restoring the old order. Think about the political situation from the perspective of the Amun priesthood, the old nobility, and the military establishment. The empire is collapsing. Egypt is losing territory. Plague is spreading. The people are suffering. And who's to blame? Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who disrupted a religious and political system that had sustained Egypt for over 1,000 years. Akhenaten might be too well protected to target directly. He's the pharaoh, divinely appointed, surrounded by guards loyal to him personally. But Nefertiti, she's powerful, yes, but perhaps more vulnerable. She moves around the palace. She conducts public ceremonies. She might have political enemies, even within the court. A group of conspirators, possibly including members of the military like Horemheb, possibly working with elements of the old priesthood, possibly even including people within the royal household, decides to act. They can't move against Akhenaten directly, but they can remove Nefertiti. And without her, Akhenaten might be more isolated, more vulnerable, more willing to compromise. So they poison her, or arrange an accident, or attack her directly. She's killed, and her death is presented as natural causes. And then, to ensure she can never become a martyr or symbol of resistance, they systematically erase her from history. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but palace assassinations were not uncommon in ancient Egypt. We have evidence of plots against pharaohs, of royal family members murdered for political advantage, of power struggles that turned bloody. It's not paranoid to suggest that Nefertiti might have been eliminated. It's actually historically plausible. November 4th, 1922. British archaeologist Howard Carter, working for his patron Lord Carnarvon, discovers a step cut into the bedrock of the Valley of the Kings. Within days, he's uncovered a sealed doorway with Tutankhamun's cartouche stamped on it. The tomb of the boy king, substantially intact, filled with treasures beyond imagination. It's the archaeological discovery of the century, perhaps the discovery of all time. When Carter and Carnarvon peer through a small hole into the burial chamber and see wonderful things in the flickering candlelight, they're looking at the most spectacular treasure ever found in Egypt. Gold everywhere. Statues, chariots, jewelry, furniture, clothing, weapons, food, wine, and at the center of it all, the mummified body of Tutankhamun himself, encased in 3 nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold. The discovery makes front-page news around the world. It launches a global fascination with ancient Egypt that continues to this day. Egyptomania sweeps through popular culture. Fashion, architecture, film, literature, all influenced by the treasures of the boy king. But here's what most people don't know. Hidden in Tutankhamun's tomb, buried in the mass of artifacts, were clues that would eventually lead us to Nefertiti. Among the treasures, archaeologists found items that originally belonged to other people. Boxes and containers with names that had been erased, and replaced with Tutankhamun's name. Some of these items bore traces of Nefertiti's cartouche, crudely scratched out. Others had Ankhesenamun's name, or Meritaten's, or eyes. The tomb had been filled with whatever was available, grabbing items from palace storerooms, including things that had belonged to other members of the royal family. This tells us something important. Tutankhamun's burial was rushed. He died young, probably around age 18 or 19, and there wasn't time to prepare a proper royal tomb. So they used a small tomb, probably originally intended for a noble, and filled it with whatever treasures they could gather quickly. And some of those treasures had belonged to Nefertiti. Where was her tomb? Where were her burial goods supposed to be? If items from her funeral equipment were sitting in palace storerooms, available to be repurposed for Tutankhamun's burial, does that mean she was never properly buried? Or that her tomb was opened and looted early? Now let's talk about KV-55, discovered in 1907 by Edward Ayrton, 15 years before Tutankhamun's tomb. KV-55 is one of the strangest burial sites ever found in the Valley of the Kings. It's a small tomb, hastily prepared, containing a single wooden coffin. But the coffin is weird. It's clearly royal, covered in gold leaf, but the gold has been ripped off the face, as if someone wanted to obliterate the identity of whoever was inside. The cartouches on the coffin have been deliberately removed. The inscriptions have been damaged. And inside, a mummy in terrible condition. When archaeologists first examined the mummy in 1907, they determined it was male, probably in his 20s. But the body was in such bad shape, and the examination techniques of 1907 were so primitive compared to modern standards, that the identification was uncertain. For decades, Egyptologists debated. Was this Akhenaten? The age seemed wrong, but maybe the original analysis was incorrect. Was it Smenkhkare? Was it some other member of the Amarna royal family? Nobody knew for certain. And then came the DNA revolution. February 2010. Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, announces the results of a comprehensive DNA study of royal mummies from the 18th dynasty. This is cutting-edge science applied to ancient history. The team extracted DNA from multiple mummies, including Tutankhamun, the KV-55 mummy, and several unidentified female mummies discovered in various royal caches. The study was enormous in scope. They analyzed short tandem repeats, Y chromosomal DNA, and mitochondrial DNA. They established genetic relationships between individuals. They determined parentage. And the results, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, were shocking. First, the KV-55 mummy was confirmed to be Tutankhamun's father. The genetic evidence was conclusive. This means it's almost certainly Akhenaten, despite the age discrepancy. Either the original age estimate was wrong, or Akhenaten died younger than historians thought, or there's some other explanation we haven't considered. But here's the real bombshell. Remember the younger lady mummy from tomb KV-35? She was determined to be Tutankhamun's mother, and the DNA analysis showed she was a full sister to the KV-55 mummy. In other words, Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings. Brother and sister, Akhenaten and his full sister, whose name we don't know. This creates massive confusion. We know Akhenaten married Nefertiti. She was his great royal wife. So who is this unnamed sister? And where does Nefertiti fit into all of this? The DNA study raised more questions than it answered. Was Nefertiti actually Akhenaten's sister, and her foreign or non-royal origins were a fiction? Was Tutankhamun's mother someone else entirely, a minor wife or concubine whose name hasn't survived? Is the younger lady Nefertiti, and the DNA results suggest a family relationship more complex than we understood? Let's focus on this mummy, because she might be the key to everything. The younger lady was discovered in 1898 by Victor Loret in tomb KV 35, which was the burial place of Amenhotep II, a pharaoh who ruled almost a century before Akhenaten. But she wasn't buried there originally. KV 35 was used as a cache, a hiding place where priests in the late New Kingdom period stored royal mummies to protect them from tomb robbers. The Valley of the Kings was being systematically looted during the 20th and 21st dynasties, and the priests were desperately trying to save what they could. The younger lady, when discovered, was in terrible condition. Her face had been smashed. Her left arm was missing, though it was later found separately in the tomb. She had been roughly handled at some point, either during the ancient reburial or possibly during looting. She was lying in an awkward position, one arm across her chest, her body showing signs of having been moved multiple times. And most disturbingly, her face showed evidence of trauma. Real trauma, not just post-mortem damage. CT scans conducted in 2010 as part of the DNA study revealed extraordinary details. The woman died in her mid-20s to early 30s. She had been a healthy, well-fed woman, consistent with royal status. Her teeth were in excellent condition, showing she had access to good food and medical care. Her bones showed no signs of disease or malnutrition, but the scan showed something disturbing. There was evidence of trauma to the left side of her face, a fracture to the cheekbone and eye socket, the kind of injury that could be caused by a blow from a blunt object. Was this inflicted before death, or was it post-mortem damage? The forensic experts who examined the scans are divided. Some believe the injury was perimortem, meaning it occurred around the time of death, possibly contributing to it. Others think it's post-mortem damage from rough handling or looting. The mummification process itself, combined with 3,000 years of decay, makes it nearly impossible to determine with absolute certainty. But here's where it gets really interesting. Forensic specialists have attempted to reconstruct what the younger lady looked like in life. Using the CT scan data, they created a three-dimensional model of her skull, then added tissue depth markers based on statistical averages for Egyptian women of that period. The result is a facial reconstruction, and the reconstructed face shows a woman with high cheekbones, an elegant facial structure, a graceful neck, and features that are remarkably similar to the famous bust of Nefertiti. Not identical, because one is a living face, and the other is an idealized sculpture. But similar enough that some researchers believe this is Nefertiti herself. Other researchers are skeptical. Facial reconstruction is not an exact science. There's a lot of subjective interpretation involved. The similarity to Nefertiti's bust might be coincidental. High cheekbones and elegant features were probably common among elite Egyptian women who had good nutrition and medical care. And then there's the DNA problem. If the younger lady is Tutankhamun's mother, and Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, then she can't be Nefertiti unless Nefertiti was Akhenaten's sister. And we have no historical evidence for that relationship, unless the historical records are wrong, unless they deliberately concealed an incestuous marriage that was politically problematic, unless Nefertiti's mysterious origins were a cover story for the uncomfortable truth that she was Akhenaten's full sister. August 2015. Nicholas Reeves, a British Egyptologist working at the University of Arizona, publishes a paper that sends shockwaves through the archaeological community. The paper is titled "The Burial of Nefertiti," and it proposes something extraordinary. Reeves has been studying high-resolution digital scans of Tutankhamun's tomb, produced by the Spanish company Factum Arte for a conservation project. These scans are incredibly detailed, capturing every crack, every paint stroke, every tiny irregularity in the tomb walls. And Reeves has noticed something nobody else has seen in the 93 years since Howard Carter discovered the tomb. There are straight lines in the painted plaster of the burial chamber walls. Subtle, barely visible, but there. Lines that suggest the existence of sealed doorways hidden behind the painted surfaces. One on the northern wall, one on the western wall. Doorways that were plastered over and then decorated to make them invisible, to make the chamber appear smaller than it actually is. Reeves proposes that Tutankhamun's tomb isn't actually a complete tomb. It's an antechamber, a front room, leading to something larger behind. The burial was hastily done because Tutankhamun died young and unexpectedly around age 18 or 19. They needed to bury him quickly, and the only space available was this small tomb, which might have been originally intended for a or another high official. But Reeves goes further. He argues that before Tutankhamun was buried there, this space served as the outer chambers of someone else's tomb. Someone who was buried with full royal honors, in a complete tomb complex, sealed and hidden. And he believes that behind the northern wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, there is another chamber, a larger chamber, containing an undisturbed royal burial. The burial of a pharaoh. Specifically, the burial of Queen Nefertiti herself, ruling as pharaoh under the name Neferuaten. Think about what this means. The most famous royal tomb ever discovered might actually contain a hidden treasure even greater than what Carter found. An intact pharaoh's burial, never looted, never disturbed, sealed away for over 3,000 years. And not just any pharaoh, but Nefertiti, the most beautiful and mysterious queen in Egyptian history. The media goes crazy. Headlines around the world scream about Nefertiti's hidden tomb. Documentaries are rushed into production. The internet explodes with speculation. It's one of the biggest archaeological stories in decades. But is it true? Reeves's theory is too explosive to ignore. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, initially skeptical, authorizes a preliminary investigation. In November 2015, Japanese radar specialist Hirokatsu Watanabe from Radar Corp Japan is invited to conduct ground-penetrating radar scans of the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending electromagnetic pulses into a surface and measuring the reflections. Different materials reflect radar differently. Solid stone produces one signature. Empty space produces another. If there are hidden chambers behind the walls, the radar should detect them. Watanabe conducts his scans with dozens of journalists, photographers, and Egyptian officials watching. It takes several hours. The radar equipment is wheeled along the northern and western walls, methodically scanning every section. And then, after analyzing the data, Watanabe makes an announcement. He believes there is approximately 90% probability that there are voids, empty spaces, behind both walls. On the northern wall, he detects what appears to be a corridor or chamber. On the western wall, another possible space. The news goes viral. Nefertiti's tomb has been found. Or has it? Reeves is cautiously optimistic. The Egyptian authorities are more reserved. They want more evidence before making any definitive claims. Tutankhamun's tomb is one of the most important archaeological sites on Earth, a UNESCO World Heritage location. They're not going to damage it based on one radar scan. So they authorize more studies, more scans, more experts. The investigation continues. In March 2016, a second team conducts more extensive radar scans. This team, also using Japanese equipment but different methodologies, confirms that there appear to be anomalies in the walls, spaces that might be chambers. But the results are less conclusive than Watanabe's initial scan. There are definitely anomalies, but whether they're actual chambers or just irregularities in the bedrock is unclear. February 2018. The Egyptian authorities authorize a third investigation, this time by an Italian team from the Polytechnic University of Turin, led by Franco Porcelli. This team uses a different type of ground-penetrating radar, more advanced, theoretically, more accurate. They spend several days conducting meticulous scans of all 4 walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, using multiple frequencies, cross-checking their results, trying to eliminate any ambiguity. And their conclusion? There is no convincing evidence of hidden chambers. The anomalies detected by the previous teams are most likely just natural irregularities in the limestone bedrock, or small voids created by the rock's natural structure, not large chambers. So, who's right? Why are different teams reaching different conclusions? The answer is that ground-penetrating radar is not a magic X-ray machine. It's a tool that requires interpretation. Different frequencies penetrate to different depths and provide different resolution. The composition of the walls matters. The technique used to plaster and paint the walls matters. The presence of moisture, the density of the stone, the angle of the scan, all of these factors affect the results. The Japanese teams detected anomalies. That's not in dispute. But are those anomalies large chambers containing a pharaoh's burial? Or are they just small, irregular voids in the rock, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in natural limestone? Nicholas Reeves hasn't given up. He continues to argue that the linear traces he observed in the high-resolution scans are real and significant. He points out that the Italian team was looking for large voids, but a plastered-over doorway might not show up as a large void because the door itself would be filled with rubble or plaster. He's calling for different kinds of investigations, possibly using newer technologies that have been developed since 2018. But there's another factor at play here that we need to talk about: politics. Egypt's antiquities are not just archaeological treasures. They're sources of national pride, economic assets, and political capital. The discovery of Nefertiti's tomb would be a sensation beyond anything in recent archaeological history. It would draw millions of additional tourists to Egypt. It would generate enormous international attention. The economic impact could be measured in billions of dollars. For a country that depends heavily on tourism revenue, this is significant. But at the same time, the Egyptian government is understandably cautious. What if they authorize an invasive investigation, drilling holes, or removing sections of the painted plaster from Tutankhamun's tomb, and find nothing? The international embarrassment would be enormous. Worse, they would have damaged one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world for no reason. There's also the ethical dimension. Tutankhamun's tomb is irreplaceable. The painted walls are 3,000 years old. The pigments are fragile. Any invasive investigation risks permanent damage. Is it worth potentially damaging this priceless heritage site based on inconclusive radar scans? Conservation archaeologists would say no. The precautionary principle suggests that when you're dealing with irreplaceable cultural heritage, you don't take risks unless you have overwhelming evidence that the potential discovery justifies the potential damage. But other archaeologists would argue that if there really is an intact pharaoh's burial behind those walls, not investigating would be a tragedy. We might be missing the most important archaeological discovery in a century because we're too afraid to look. There's also a historical dimension. Egypt has a complicated relationship with foreign archaeologists. During the colonial era, European and American archaeologists often treated Egyptian antiquities as their own discoveries, shipping treasures off to museums in London, Berlin, Paris, New York. The bust of Nefertiti itself sits in a museum in Berlin, despite repeated Egyptian requests for its return. Modern Egypt wants to ensure that any major discovery is handled by Egyptian archaeologists, benefits the Egyptian people, and stays in Egypt. This is entirely reasonable and justified. But it creates tension with international researchers who have expertise, funding, and technology that Egypt might not have immediate access to. Nicholas Reeves is British. The radar teams were Japanese and Italian. If the investigation proceeds, who leads it? Who gets credit? Where do the discoveries go? These aren't trivial questions. They're about national sovereignty, cultural heritage, and the politics of archaeology in a post-colonial world. Let's engage in some informed speculation. If Reeves is right, if there are hidden chambers behind those walls, what might we find? Best case scenario? An undisturbed royal burial. Nefertiti's mummy, perfectly preserved by the dry conditions of the Valley of the Kings, lying in a nest of gilded coffins even more spectacular than Tutankhamun's. Gold everywhere. Jewelry, furniture, chariots, clothing, cosmetics. Everything a pharaoh would need in the afterlife. And more importantly, inscriptions. walls covered in text that could tell us definitively what happened to her, how she came to power, how long she ruled, how she died, what her final years were like. A complete biographical record that would answer every question we've been asking for over a century. Nefertiti was, by all accounts, at least as important as Tutankhamun, probably more so. If her burial is intact, the treasure might rival or exceed what Carter found. Remember, Tutankhamun was a minor king who ruled for only about 9 years and died young. Nefertiti, if she ruled as pharaoh, had access to greater resources and would have had more time to prepare her burial. The artwork alone would be priceless. Amarna art is distinctive and highly valued. A tomb full of Amarna-style paintings, sculptures and artifacts would be an archaeological and artistic treasure trove. But there are less exciting possibilities. Maybe the chambers exist, but they were looted in antiquity. The Valley of the Kings was systematically robbed during the Third Intermediate Period, around 1000 BC. Maybe Nefertiti's tomb was discovered and emptied then, leaving nothing but debris. Or maybe the chambers were sealed precisely because they're empty. Maybe they were intended for someone else, but never used. Maybe they're storage spaces or unfinished rooms that were sealed off during Tutankhamun's burial. Or maybe, and this is the most frustrating possibility, the chambers don't exist at all, and the radar anomalies are just natural features of the bedrock. We won't know until someone actually looks. Now let's talk about the theories that mainstream Egyptology is uncomfortable discussing. The darker possibilities, the conspiracies. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Every piece of evidence we've discussed can be interpreted in more sinister ways. Let's start with the most obvious suspects. The priests of Amun. For over 1,000 years, they had been the most powerful religious institution in Egypt. They controlled vast wealth, commanded political influence, and had the authority to legitimize or delegitimize pharaohs. Then comes Akhenaten and Nefertiti, declaring that Amun doesn't exist. Closing the temples, seizing the wealth, destroying statues, moving the capital away from Thebes, the heart of Amun's power. Building a new city dedicated to a new god. From the priesthood's perspective, this isn't just a religious reform. It's an existential threat. They're not just losing money and influence. Their entire worldview, their religious identity, everything they've built for generations, everything their fathers and grandfathers built, is being torn down and declared false. Do you think they accepted this quietly? Or do you think they organized resistance? These were educated, connected, wealthy men who had spent their entire lives wielding power. They had networks throughout Egypt. They had contacts in the army, in the provincial governments, in noble families. What if they organized a conspiracy? What if they infiltrated Akhenaten's court? What if they worked systematically to undermine the Amarna regime from within, waiting for their moment to strike? And if they did, wouldn't Nefertiti be their primary target? Akhenaten might have been the ideologue, but Nefertiti was the face of the revolution. She was the one performing the religious rituals. She was the one shown in art, wielding pharaonic power. She was the one who couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Remove her, and maybe Akhenaten becomes isolated. Maybe he becomes more vulnerable to pressure. Maybe he can be convinced to compromise. Maybe the revolution collapses without its most charismatic figure. And then there's the military dimension. During Akhenaten's reign, Egypt loses territory. Vassal states rebel or switch allegiance. The empire shrinks, and the army, Egypt's professional military establishment, is furious. These are men who have devoted their lives to expanding and defending Egypt's borders. They've fought and bled for the empire. They've watched their comrades die in foreign wars. And now they're being told that military glory doesn't matter, that conquest isn't important, that the only thing that matters is serving the Aten. Horemheb, who will eventually become Pharaoh himself after Tutankhamun and I die, is a military general during the Amarna period. We don't know exactly what positions he held under Akhenaten, but we know he was in the army, and we know he rose to become one of the most powerful men in Egypt. Later, after he becomes Pharaoh, Horemheb leads the restoration of traditional Egyptian power. He rebuilds the military. He reconquers lost territories. He restores Egypt's international prestige. And he aggressively erases the memory of the Amarna period, going even further than I or Tutankhamun in obliterating Akhenaten's legacy. This is a man who hated what Akhenaten represented. A man who believed that Akhenaten and his religious revolution had nearly destroyed Egypt. A man with the military power to act on those beliefs. What if Horemheb and other military leaders conspired with the Amun priesthood? What if they worked together to destabilize the Amarna regime? What if they decided that Nefertiti had to go? They couldn't move against Akhenaten directly while he was alive and healthy. But Nefertiti, she moved around the palace. She conducted public ceremonies. She traveled. She had her own residences. She might have been vulnerable in ways that Akhenaten wasn't. A quick assassination, poison in her wine, a staged accident, an attack made to look like illness, and then a cover-up, presenting her death as natural, waiting for the right moment to complete the coup. Now let's go back to that younger lady mummy and examine the evidence of violence with fresh eyes. Remember the trauma to her face, the fracture to the cheekbone and eye socket. Modern forensic analysis can sometimes distinguish between ante-mortem injuries, before death, peri-mortem injuries, around the time of death, and post-mortem damage. The key indicators are healing, blood infiltration in the bone, and the pattern of fracture. The CT scans of the younger lady show a fracture pattern that some forensic experts believe is consistent with a blow from a blunt object while the person was alive. There's no evidence of healing, which means the injury occurred shortly before or at the time of death. If this interpretation is correct, we're looking at evidence of violence. Someone struck this woman in the face with enough force to fracture her cheekbone. Was this the cause of death? Probably not directly. The injury, while painful, wouldn't necessarily be fatal. But it might have been part of a larger attack. Or it might have occurred during a struggle. Imagine this scenario. Year 12 or 14 of Akhenaten's reign. The empire is crumbling. Plague is spreading. The people are suffering. The old priesthood is organizing resistance. The military is restless. And into this powder keg, conspirators make their move. They attack Nefertiti, either in the palace or during travel. Maybe they try to capture her. Maybe she fights back. Someone strikes her in the face. She's subdued, taken somewhere, killed by poison or strangulation or some other method that doesn't leave obvious marks on the bones. Her body is mummified, but hastily, without the full royal treatment she would normally receive. Her burial is quick and secret. Maybe she's initially placed in the royal tomb at Amarna, but when the city is abandoned, her mummy is moved, hidden in a cache with other royal bodies, deliberately made unidentifiable to prevent anyone from discovering what really happened to her. And then there's the post-mortem damage. Someone, at some point, deliberately smashed her face. Why? If this is Nefertiti, maybe it was an act of desecration by her enemies, making sure that even in death she couldn't be recognized or honored. Or maybe it was done during the reburial, an attempt to hide her identity because her death was embarrassing or criminal. If she was murdered by people who later became powerful, they would have every reason to ensure her body couldn't be definitively identified. After her death, assuming this theory is correct, a massive cover-up begins. This isn't just historical revisionism. This is active suppression of evidence. Her burial is kept secret or deliberately obscured. Her monuments are systematically destroyed, not just neglected, but actively demolished. Her images are defaced with almost violent intensity, as if the people destroying them harbor personal hatred. Her name is chiseled out from every inscription that can be found. Compare this to how other controversial figures were treated. Akhenaten was erased. Yes, but some images survived. Some inscriptions were missed. His tomb, though vandalized, wasn't completely obliterated. Same with Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh whose memory later rulers tried to suppress. Damage was extensive, but not total. But Nefertiti's erasure is more thorough. It's as if someone was systematically hunting down every trace of her existence and destroying it. That level of effort suggests something beyond political convenience. It suggests guilt, fear, a need to ensure that the truth could never emerge. Who would have orchestrated this? Probably a coalition. The Amun priesthood, who wanted revenge and restoration of their power. Military leaders like Horemheb, who blamed the Amarna period for Egypt's weakness. Court officials like Ai, who might have been trying to protect his own position and possibly his own role in what happened. These were the people who controlled Egypt after Akhenaten's death. They had the power, the motivation, and the means to erase Nefertiti from history. And they almost succeeded. For over 3,000 years, Nefertiti was barely more than a footnote in Egyptian history, a name mentioned occasionally, a few fragmentary statues and inscriptions. It's only through modern archaeology, through accidental discoveries and painstaking reconstruction, that we're beginning to recover her story. All right, let's step back from the conspiracy theories and talk about what we can actually prove with the evidence available. Because it's important to distinguish between what we know, what we can reasonably infer, and what is pure speculation. Fact 1. Nefertiti was one of the most powerful women in ancient Egyptian history. The artistic and inscriptional evidence makes this absolutely clear. She wasn't just a king's wife. She was a political and religious figure in her own right, wielding authority in ways that were unprecedented for Egyptian queens. Fact 2. She disappeared from the historical record around year 12 to 14 of Akhenaten's reign. After appearing prominently and consistently for the first part of his reign, her name and image suddenly become rare and then vanish. Something happened to her, but we don't know what. Fact 3. There's evidence of a co-regent named Nefertiti during the late Amarna period, and possibly for a brief period after Akhenaten's death. This ruler's gender and identity are ambiguous in the sources, but many scholars believe it might have been Nefertiti ruling under a new name. Fact 4. DNA analysis has identified several royal mummies from this period, including Akhenaten, probably, and a mummy called the Younger Lady, who was Tutankhamun's mother. The Younger Lady shows evidence of trauma to her face, though whether this was inflicted before or after death is debated. Fact 5. Some researchers believe the Younger Lady might be Nefertiti, but this identification is contested. The DNA evidence suggests Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, which complicates the identification because Nefertiti's origins, as far as we know them, don't suggest she was Akhenaten's sister. Fact 6. Ground-penetrating radar has detected anomalies in the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb that might indicate hidden chambers. However, different scanning teams have reached different conclusions, and no invasive investigation has been authorized to definitively determine what's behind the walls. Fact 7. Nefertiti's name and image were systematically erased from monuments and inscriptions after the end of the Amarna period. This erasure was more thorough than what was done to other controversial figures from the same era, suggesting she was specifically targeted for historical obliteration. These are the facts. Everything else, all the theories about murder, conspiracy, hidden tombs, secret burials, palace intrigue. It's informed speculation based on historical context and circumstantial evidence, but still speculation. If we had to construct the most likely scenario based on current evidence, here's what probably happened. Nefertiti was a powerful queen, possibly of foreign origin, who played a central role in Akhenaten's religious revolution. She was genuinely influential, not just a figurehead. She helped shape policy, conducted religious ceremonies, and exercised real political authority. Around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, something changed. The most likely explanation is that she died of natural causes. Disease, complications from childbirth, plague, illness. Ancient Egypt was dangerous even for royalty. Given the evidence of widespread disease during this period, natural death is the simplest explanation. However, there's a significant possibility that she didn't die at this point, but instead took on a new identity. She might have become the co-regent Nefertiti, ruling alongside Akhenaten under a new name, possibly taking on masculine titles to legitimize her position as pharaoh. If this is true, she likely recognized that pure Aten worship was politically unsustainable. She tried to reconcile with the Amun priesthood, restoring some of the old temples while maintaining the Aten cult. This would have put her in conflict with Akhenaten, who refused to compromise on his religious vision. When Akhenaten died, the political situation became unstable. The young Tutankhamun was placed on the throne, but he was too young to rule effectively. The real power was held by Ai and Horemheb and possibly other court officials. If Nefertiti was still alive at this point, ruling as Neferuaten, she probably tried to maintain her position. But the forces arrayed against her were too strong. The Amun priesthood wanted complete restoration. The military wanted a return to traditional Egyptian power. The old nobility wanted the Amarna experiment ended. She was removed from power either through forced abdication, natural death, or possibly violence. Her death was presented as natural, regardless of the actual circumstances. She was buried, probably with some honors, because completely denying her a burial would have been too shocking even for her enemies. But then began the systematic campaign to erase her memory. This wasn't just about her personally. It was about what she represented. The entire Amarna period needed to be delegitimized to consolidate the new regime's power. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, even Tutankhamun to some extent, all had to be removed from official history. Nefertiti's erasure was particularly thorough because she embodied the most radical aspects of the Amarna revolution. A woman wielding pharaonic power, a foreign queen, possibly, presiding over Egypt. The face of a religious transformation that nearly destroyed the country's traditional structure. The new regime couldn't allow her to be remembered as anything other than a mistake that had been corrected. So they tried to erase her completely. Here's the exciting part. We live in an era where technology is advancing so rapidly that the mystery of Nefertiti might actually be solved in our lifetimes. Tools and techniques that didn't exist 10 years ago are now being used to unlock ancient secrets. Ground-penetrating radar is improving constantly. New scanning technologies using muon particles, similar to those used to discover hidden chambers in the Great Pyramid in 2017, could provide definitive evidence of voids behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb without any invasive investigation. Muon tomography works by detecting cosmic ray muons that pass through matter. Different densities of material affect how many muons pass through. An empty chamber would allow more muons through than solid rock. It's non-invasive, it's accurate, and it could settle the hidden chamber question definitively. DNA technology is also improving dramatically. Even if we never find new mummies, better analysis of existing samples might clarify the relationships between the Amarna period royals. We might be able to definitively identify the younger lady, confirm whether she's Nefertiti, and determine the family relationships with greater accuracy. Ancient DNA used to be incredibly difficult to work with. It degrades, becomes contaminated, produces ambiguous results. But new extraction and sequencing techniques are making it possible to recover genetic information from samples that were previously unusable. Isotope analysis can tell us where a person grew up based on the chemical signature in their teeth and bones. Different geographic regions have different isotope ratios in their water and food, and these ratios get incorporated into growing bones and teeth. If we could do comprehensive isotope studies on the younger lady, we might be able to determine if she was born in Egypt or came from abroad. If she shows isotope signatures from Syria or the Near East, that would support the theory that Nefertiti was a foreign princess. If she shows Egyptian signatures, that would suggest she was native-born. Facial reconstruction technology is becoming incredibly sophisticated. Using CT scans and advanced computer modeling, we can create highly accurate reconstructions of what ancient people looked like. If we could do a definitive facial reconstruction of the younger lady and compare it to depictions of Nefertiti using computer analysis rather than subjective human judgment, we might finally be able to determine if they're the same person. Let's zoom out and talk about what Nefertiti's story means beyond just one woman's fate. Ancient Egypt is often portrayed as a civilization that was relatively progressive regarding women's rights, at least compared to other ancient cultures. Women could own property, initiate divorce, run businesses, serve as priestesses. Egyptian queens wielded significant influence. But Nefertiti represents something more. She represents female political power at the very highest level, exercised openly and without apology. And the fact that her memory was so thoroughly erased suggests that even in Egypt, there were limits to how much power a woman could wield before the patriarchal establishment pushed back violently. This isn't just an Egyptian phenomenon. Throughout history and across cultures, powerful women have been erased, diminished, or vilified. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, had her monuments defaced after her death by her stepson Thutmose III. Cleopatra, one of the ancient world's most brilliant political minds, is remembered more for her romantic relationships than for her governance and diplomacy. Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China in her own right, was vilified by Confucian historians who couldn't accept female imperial authority. When women gain power that threatens the patriarchal structure, the system responds by erasing them from history or distorting their stories into cautionary tales about female ambition. Nefertiti's erasure is part of this pattern. And the fact that we're still trying to find her 3,000 years later is testimony to how effective that erasure was. But it's also testimony to something else: the determination of archaeologists, historians, and researchers to recover these lost stories. Every time we identify a powerful woman who was deliberately erased, every time we reconstruct a story that was supposed to be forgotten, we're correcting a historical injustice. We're proving that erasure isn't permanent. The truth endures, even if it takes millennia to uncover. And there's a beautiful irony here. They tried to erase Nefertiti. They destroyed her monuments, chiseled out her name, hid or destroyed her body. And they nearly succeeded. For 3,000 years, she was almost forgotten. But then, in 1912, that famous bust was discovered. And Nefertiti's face became one of the most recognizable images in the world. More people know what she looked like than any other figure from ancient Egypt, except perhaps Tutankhamun. She's on posters, in textbooks, in museums, in popular culture. They tried to erase her, and instead, they made her immortal. So, what really happened to Nefertiti? After all this evidence, all these theories, all this investigation spanning over a century of archaeology, what can we definitively say? Here's the truth: we don't know. Not for certain. Not yet. She might be the younger lady mummy, her face smashed by enemies or damaged during reburial, her body hidden among other royal dead in tomb KF35. The DNA evidence and facial reconstruction support this possibility, even though the family relationships are confusing. She might be sealed behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb, waiting in darkness for someone brave enough to investigate, preserved in an intact royal burial that could be the greatest archaeological discovery of the century. The radar evidence is intriguing, even if it's not conclusive. She might have been buried at Amarna and lost when the city was abandoned, her tomb looted and destroyed during the Third Intermediate Period, when the Valley of the Kings was systematically robbed. Her mummy might have been destroyed, cremated, or thrown into the Nile. She might be in a tomb we haven't discovered yet, in a location nobody has thought to search. The Valley of the Kings still yields surprises. As recently as 2006, a new tomb was discovered, KV63, proving that there are still secrets buried in those cliffs. We don't know exactly how she died. We don't know where she's buried. We don't know what her final years were like. We don't even know for certain what she looked like, since the famous bust might be an idealized portrait. But here's what we do know for certain. Nefertiti was real. She was powerful. She changed Egypt. She wielded authority that terrified her contemporaries. And despite every effort to erase her from history, despite 3,000 years of systematic obliteration, we remember her. 3,000 years after her death, her face is one of the most recognizable images from the ancient world. Her name is spoken in museums, universities, and documentaries around the globe. Her story inspires researchers, artists, historians, and millions of people fascinated by ancient mysteries. School children learn about her. Egyptologists dedicate their careers to understanding her. Technologies are developed to search for her. Millions of dollars are spent trying to uncover her secrets. They tried to erase her. They failed. And maybe that's the real ending to Nefertiti's story. Not her death, not her disappearance, but her rediscovery. The fact that despite 3 millennia of deliberate forgetting, despite the most thorough erasure campaign in ancient history, we still search for her. We still tell her story. We still refuse to let her be forgotten. She's more than a mummy in a tomb, wherever that tomb might be. She's more than a name in an inscription. She's more than a beautiful face in a museum. She's a symbol of power, beauty, intelligence, ambition, and the resilience of women's stories throughout history. She's proof that you can try to erase someone from history, but if their impact was significant enough, if their story matters enough, the truth will eventually emerge. And whether we find her tomorrow or 100 years from now, whether she's behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb or somewhere completely unexpected, her legacy is secure. Because we refuse to forget. So that's the mystery of Nefertiti. What really happened to the most beautiful and powerful woman in ancient Egypt? Was she murdered by conspirators? Is she hidden behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb? Was she the younger lady mummy with the smashed face? Will we ever find her final resting place? I want to hear your theories in the comments. Do you think the younger lady is Nefertiti? Do you believe there are hidden chambers in Tutankhamun's tomb that we should investigate? even if it means potentially damaging the painted walls. Do you think she was assassinated by the Amun priesthood? Or did she die naturally and was buried with honors? And here's a deeper question. Do you think the Egyptian authorities should authorize an invasive investigation of Tutankhamun's tomb? Is the potential discovery worth the risk of damaging an irreplaceable archaeological site? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Egypt's greatest mysteries, make sure you're subscribed to Pharaoh's Legacy and hit that notification bell. We're investigating the secrets of ancient Egypt every week, uncovering evidence that mainstream archaeology often ignores or downplays, and bringing you the truth about the most fascinating civilization in human history. Over 90% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. You're missing out on investigations like this, on cutting-edge archaeological discoveries, on mysteries that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Subscribe now. It takes 2 seconds and costs you nothing. Next week, we're investigating another explosive mystery that the establishment doesn't want us asking about. The true purpose of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Was it really just a tomb for Khufu? Or was it something far more advanced? A power plant? An astronomical observatory? A mathematical message to future civilizations? We've got evidence that will absolutely blow your mind. Your support helps us travel to archaeological sites, consult with experts, access research databases, and produce the highest quality content about ancient mysteries. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging with these mysteries. Thank you for refusing to accept simple answers to complex questions. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and remember, the truth is still buried in the sands of Egypt, hidden behind painted walls, waiting in sealed chambers, lying in unmarked tombs. But we're going to find it. This is Pharaoh's Legacy, signing off.